Hello, and today I'm going to be talking to you about the different types of ownership. There are two main types of ownership. There's private property rights and there's communal property rights. Private property rights refer to rights in rem, which gives you the right to exclude people from your property. They're deemed to be efficient, economically speaking, and they also dominate most of the Western world. Communal property, on the other hand, it gives you a right not to be excluded, but you yourself cannot exclude someone else, as you could do within the realms of private property. State property then is a hybrid creature, and this is because the power vests in one body, which is the state. So it's like a private property regime, and they can allocate and they can do what they like with their rights. Like, for example, with Downing Street, number 10, you can exclude certain people from entering it. At the same time, it's very much like communal property because it relies on negotiation and transaction costs between the people, especially where democracy is concerned. Personally, I would argue it's more like a private property regime. And this is because even in a democracy, how much do people actually get a say in what is going on with state property? It's limited. We vote in parties. We don't vote in specific policies unless there is a referendum. There is also a fourth category of property, which is a smallish one compared to the others. It's called no property. Now, the case of authority on this is Hunter and Canary Wharf, where it was established that I think television signals were deemed to be no property, i.e. nobody owns them or has the right to exclude or not to be excluded, but privileges can be there for the property to be used. But that doesn't mean that you have a right to exclude someone or not to be excluded. You can be excluded because you don't own it, privately or communally. So an example of this is the free newspapers like the Metro on the Tube. You can't say to the person next to you, no, you may not use it. At the same time, nobody can tell you, no, you're not allowed to read it. But you do have a right or privilege to read the newspaper. Now, essentially, in the words of Aristotle, no property regime exists just with private property or communal property. It's a mixed creature. It's a hybrid creature. Now, there are reasons, however, that we have to take into account of why we end up with a mixed system. Now, the advocates of private property would include Locke, which I'll have a video on, who talks about sufficiency and spoilage proviso, and he provides a justification for private property rights. You have economists such as Coase, who argue that private property is the best regime because ultimately, no matter what kind of regulation you have, the person who values a right or entitlement the most, they will get it. So therefore, he would argue for a private property regime where a lot of it is dominated by the Calabresi and Milliman type of property rules where everything is a voluntary transaction. And another example is provided by Barzell as a way of justifying private property rights. He says that the North Sea was privately allocated in 1958 and this spurred development, innovation, creation. It's the best way to go. On the other hand, you do have justification for communal property rights. It's the basis of many like Soviet systems, and sometimes it's just practical and it makes sense. But in the Western world, we're skewed towards private property, and we've already talked about some of the justifications for it. But then there are also theories against communal property, which also go somewhere in justifying our bias towards private property. Those include the notion of anti-common. This is a type of communal property whereby you have a right to exclude someone else, but because of that, you have no right yourself to use the property. So it was originally created by Michelman and then further developed by Heller, who gave the example that you have a communal garden. Everybody has a right to exclude everyone else. So you put locks on it. What happens though, you yourself cannot use the property. It's very inefficient. And this notion of anti-common was also used to explain the situation in Moscow, where the property rights were vested in so many people that ultimately the shops were left there empty and businesses were operating on the street. That's what happened. Tragedy of the commons, this is now an economic theory which is produced by Hardin, which shows, he gives the analogy of pollution and a pasture field, where essentially he says that because you don't bear the direct costs of your actions on a communal property, because the costs are divided, but yet you can benefit privately, you will not be using the land efficiently, and it can lead to exploitation, overgrazing. Now you can find this tragedy of the commons separately, but ultimately this is the economic justification of why communal property is inefficient. So how do I want to conclude this video on different types of ownership? Well, let's look at an application of Australia. Now, Australia was colonized by the British Empire, and this created a lot of problem. Now, what happened is, originally we start off with the case Miralipum and Nabalco, and I think in this case the government gave out a grant or for somebody for the company to do some digging, and the Aboriginals complained and said, "This is our land. How can you give that?" And actually, what happened is Blackburn, he enforced the view of terra nullius, which means that the land was basically unsettled, unused, nothing before the British came. The British came and settled into it, and according to international law, that means that the British law applied, and British law is what? That all the power vests in the Crown, and the Crown gives out allocations of time. And this view was enforced, and they said that, and the reason being is because the Aboriginal system of property rights was largely communal based. It could not be understood by English law, which was transplanted into Australia. So then we have the following case of Mabo in 1992. Now, the essential key point with the Mabo case is they said that this doctrine of terra nullius is actually very racist, and it's discriminatory, and it doesn't agree. Now, Dawson, who was dissenting in this case, he said actually if we are to remove the concept of terra nullius, what you do is you impugn the whole legal system. It can't exist without it. However, it can, because as the other judgment which prevailed said that it was a discriminatory and inaccurate doctrine for this day and age. And so what they said is that actually Aboriginal rights did exist. They did have a property system. Yes, like Blackburn, they might not be sophisticated, and it's not private property rights. It did exist. However, they did not reject the notion that the British Empire came in and settled in, so their laws apply, and the power rests in the Crown. So as a result of the Mabo case, we had the creation of this thing called the Native Title Act. Now, this was not an absolute act giving rise to absolute rights. It just essentially just recognized that Aboriginal rights can exist, and there are like 4 situations in which they will be extinguished. So expressly extinguished, it can be impliedly extinguished through inconsistent grant, abandonment, or surrender. So that's it. And it became more harder to get native title and to apply this kind of property ownership in the case of WIC and QLD. And also, this is largely to do with the Conservative government coming in after the Labour and wanting to change the law. But how can we put this in perspective? Well, even we need to recognise communal rights, especially in Australia, places like that, because even in Britain, we've recognised communal rights in our common law system, despite it being a private property regime. For example, in New Windsor and Mellor, and R and Oxfordshire CCX Party Sunningwell, it was recognised that communal rights in a sports ground do exist, and they could be protected by the property regime. So I hope this helps. Thank you for watching.